Hey, Dr. Barnes, coming at you from my workspace here, home in Indiana. I'll be doing my presentation on victim offender reconciliation programs for penal institutions and treatment methods. Now, going into what exactly victim offender reconciliation programs are, or VORPs, what they're referenced to many times in my presentation, they are programs structured around encounters centered through a face-to-face communication or face-to-face meeting or mediation between an offender of a crime and a victim or victims of a crime. And generally speaking, when it comes to the idea of VORPs or victim offender reconciliation programs, it doesn't always necessarily mean jail time, but it is focused and centered around these meetings, these almost like counseling sessions between an offender and, like I said, a victim or victims, depending on what exactly the crime is. Now, continuing on with it, when it comes to these types of programs between the victims and between the offenders, all the time, every time, it's guaranteed that the only way that this program can be done is if the victim wants it to be done. If a victim does not want to meet with an offender, these programs can't happen. And generally speaking, on the opposite side of that, an offender will more than likely be a voluntary participant from it. They will want to be a part of it because, one, they know that if they do in fact participate in this program, it can mean good time for them. It can look good on a parole board hearing. It can look good for an offender if they want to actively participate in a reconciliation program or a mediation between a victim and themselves. But generally speaking, offenders will want to volunteer and they'll want to participate in this in order to avoid more penalties or to lessen their time in jail or in prison. Now, moving on to the bits and pieces portion of victim offender reconciliation programs. So usually there are meetings that consist of the victim, the offender, and a trained mediator or a trained counselor, just dependent on where the program is at and who's running it. If it's government-based, if it's state-based, or if it's local, a part of a community. Now, the mediator is there to ensure fluid motion of the meeting. They want to make sure that within this meeting between a victim or victims and the offender, that the situation never becomes hostile and never becomes dangerous for anyone in that room. That's their main goal. They want to ensure the fluid motion of everything and to make sure everything goes well and goes as planned in order to help out each party that is involved in this. Now, victim offender reconciliation is seen as a form of restorative justice. And restorative justice is, in the world of the criminal justice system and the correctional facility, it's kind of new. But restorative justice is the focus of rehabilitation of offenders rather than using the punishment that is traditional incarceration or restitution. Restorative justice focuses more on rehabilitation than it does just desserts or retribution or incarceration. It's a little different form of punishment that is seen as potentially more effective and maybe even more beneficial to all parties involved in a crime. Now, the reasons that are brought up around victim offender reconciliation come from the fact that it's an alternative option to traditional incarceration. It's not normal. When someone is given the ability to be a part of a program where they can meet with who they committed a crime against, it's different. In some aspects, it's kind of scary and it makes some people feel anxious, dependent on what the crime is or dependent on who the victim is. So that's one reason behind the Victim Offender Reconciliation Program is that it's a little different, and it's not necessarily normal in the ideas of the correctional system or the criminal justice system. Other things are that when you look at victim offender reconciliation programs, they are, in a sense, cost effective, because not always are these victim offender reconciliation programs ran by the criminal justice system or necessarily ran by the county, but they can also be these community-based organizations. They can be ran from church groups. It's seen as something different than the traditional means of punishment, because when you think about incarceration, that costs a lot of money because it's housing, it's food, it could be medical treatment. But with these victim offender reconciliation programs, it's counseling sessions. It's one-on-one counseling sessions that are face-to-face. Could be half an hour, could be hours. But the cost between mediation or counseling and incarceration is drastically different. And it's a lot more cost effective to be able to meet with offenders and victims than it is to lock them up. More things based on victim offender reconciliation is the face-to-face interaction can help both parties. It's not used at all to hurt. It's used to help in every aspect. So for a victim, it helps them because they can reconcile with their offender. They can meet their offender face-to-face and have a conversation with them. For the offender, it can do the same. For the offender, it could lift weight off their shoulders. It can make them relax. It can make them feel better knowing that they're able to explain why they did what they did. They're able to see their victim on a different level and in a different environment than something that could be hostile or something that could be dangerous. And really, when you look at these victim offender reconciliation programs, they're a lot more community-based. There's a lot more community involvement than just the courts and the jails. It brings communities together from the good side and from the bad side. So it's just more of a blended institution. It's more of a blended program than traditional means of punishment. Now, some of the, actually backing up before that, talking about some of the outcomes that can come from the mediations and the counseling. Well, generally speaking, after the mediation is done, after the program has been completed, there could be written agreements between the victim and offender. And basically, that can mean a multitude of things. That could be the offender pledging to pay back in damages, whether it's property damages, whether it's personal damages. That could mean that the offender pledges to check into rehab, or pledges to do better with themselves and do better with their life and their decisions that they make on a day-to-day basis. But talking about things like money damage repayment, that's part of a written agreement. When it comes to some of these cases, dependent on what actually happens and what the crime was, jail time is still an option in this, dependent on what the crime is, or in some cases what the victim and the offender think is best. So jail time is still a viable option. If it was a drug-related offense, if someone was high or if someone was drunk and they committed a crime, they can also, a possible outcome from this can also be voluntary check into drug rehab or Alcoholics Anonymous, an alcoholic rehabilitation center. There's all sorts of different rehab facilities that are also outcomes, that can be potential outcomes. If an offender sees that they have an issue and they want to do better with themselves, they might look at rehab as a potential outcome after their mediation. There's also community service. They could agree to fix up the community that they live in. If this crime caused property damage to a community organization or a community property, they can pledge their community service in order to rebuild it, to fix it up, and to make it like it was before the crime had been committed. Another thing that happens and is prevalent is counseling. You have group counseling sessions or one-on-one counseling sessions, because dependent on the crime, it might have been something that was done out of mental incapacity. If someone had been previously traumatized and they had a trigger that set them off that made them commit a crime, they would go see a counselor to talk about it. They'd go see a counselor to try and alleviate their situation and to try to better themselves. And in other senses, they might, as an offender, the offender might want to talk more about the crimes that they committed. Maybe they're a repeat offender. Maybe they want to talk about how they can't get out of that life, how they want to better themselves, and how they want to get out of the life of committing crime, and they don't want to do that any longer. So there's multiple different outcomes that can come from victim-offender reconciliation that's not necessarily the traditional incarceration or jail time. Now, getting into the purpose, like, what is the end game? What is the goal of victim-offender reconciliation programs? Now, one of the main purposes is to attempt to get the offender to make right their wrongs with their victim. They want to make the offender understand what they did. They want to make the offender know that what they did was wrong and that they shouldn't do it again. And with that interaction between an offender and a victim can be really, really beneficial, because in some cases, if the victim is able to express their thoughts and their feelings, an offender knows how much they've hurt them. An offender knows what, not only possibly the physical damage that they've done, but the emotional, the mental damage that they've done to a victim. So basically, one of the main goals and the main purpose is to make the offender understand what they did. And also, when it comes to the mediation and it comes to these meetings, it's mutual. One of the purposes is to basically reassure that this isn't a one-way street. It's not the fact that the victim is always right and the offender is wrong. It's a mutual kind of meeting common grounds between one another, and not necessarily this is a one-way thing, you're wrong, I'm right, as an offender or as a victim. Regardless, it's supposed to be mutual. It's supposed to be the victim and offender finding common grounds. Going on a little bit more with the purpose, another main purpose found in this program is to make the offender understand the law that they broke. Because sometimes offenders aren't necessarily aware of every action that they take. They might think that it's not that big of a deal, or that it's more of a deviance kind of act and not a criminal act. So in order to make them understand what they've done wrong is also a part and a portion of victim-offender reconciliation. They want to help make aware what the offender did wrong. And they want to make sure, and they want to try to help prevent it and to help stop those further actions from happening. Offenders, for themselves, they have a better chance to explain what they did and why they did it. If an offender committed a crime because they were down on their luck, didn't have any money, wanted to pay for drugs, or were trying to support their kids, they have a chance to say that. They have a chance to tell others. They have a chance to tell the victim, make the victim understand what was going on in their head when they did what they did. Now, switching over into the history of victim-offender reconciliation programs. So the first ever victim-offender reconciliation program to date happened in Ontario, Canada in May of 1974. And now, in 1974, it's 2020 now, we're looking at over 40 years of continued victim-offender reconciliation programs. So we just keep moving up, and the amount of programs that we have are constantly growing, and they're constantly learning more. So from 1974 to now, we just have continued growth, which is a great thing for the criminal justice system. the community organizations, and the correctional facilities. Now, going a little bit more into the history, this wasn't something that was enacted initially from a legislative standpoint. It wasn't a bill that got brought in to introduce a different kind of program for correctional systems. It was based on the fact a judge was given or someone that had went to trial in Canada, a probation officer had convinced a judge that instead of immediately giving them jail time, give the offenders a chance to meet with the victims and make right what their wrongs were. And after meeting the victims, the offenders were ordered to pay their restitution. They're ordered to pay the damages that they made. So they missed out on jail time after meeting with their victims. And that was how this all blossomed into what it's being now and what it's growing into. Now, when we talk about the first United States program, the first program started in Elkhart, Indiana in 1978. So just 4 years after the involuntarily first reconciliation program was in Elkhart, Indiana. Now, getting up into the present day, we are hovering over an estimated 400 victim offender reconciliation programs throughout the United States. And in addition to that, there are similar numbers that are starting to grow in Europe. So it's not only something that's going on in North America, but rather the world is starting to view victim offender reconciliation programs as something positive and something that can help with the criminal justice system. Now, when we look at who exactly runs the programs, whether it's federal government, whether it's state, whether it's local, whether it's community, charitable organizations, there was a telephone interview that was conducted in 2010, a little dated, but the numbers are steadily increasing from these. So in 2010, there were 116 different victim offender reconciliation programs that were interviewed. Of those 116, 42% were ran by community-based agencies, 23 were ran by church organizations, 17% were by correctional departments, so local or state ran, 3% were victim service agencies, kind of like victim advocacy offices, and the other 11% were managed by other local, state, or federal government services. But the number that sticks out a lot is the 42% that were community-based agencies and not the local or state governments. It wasn't necessarily seen as a bureaucratic thing, but it's more of a local level community-based agency that runs a lot of the victim offender reconciliation programs, and that's a positive. Now, when someone wants to go into a victim offender reconciliation programs, there are guidelines that follow it. There are criteria that you have to meet, and there are certain things that have to happen within the courts to enable someone to be a part of it. One is obviously the victim has to want to be a part of it. If the victim doesn't want to be a part of it, it doesn't happen. But kind of carrying on to that, cases are referred when mediation is agreed between victim and offenders. So like I said, the victim doesn't want to do it, it's not going to happen. It has to be something mutual, done on both ends. Also, another thing that goes into it, if an offender pleads guilty to a crime, the use of victim offender reconciliation is normally used as probation. A separate form from incarceration, it's more of a probationary tool. And one of the things that victim offender reconciliation programs want to continue to make people aware of is that it's not used as a blame game. It's something mutual between the two, and it's not you're right, I'm wrong. Now, the perspective of the victim offender reconciliation program. Now, the number of offenders who are given the option to meet face-to-face with the ones they victimize is steadily increasing. So what that means is there are becoming more and more cases where victim offender reconciliation is being used. It's not decreasing, but it's increasing. More people are wanting to be a part of it, and criminal justice officials are gaining a lot more knowledge and a lot more positive attitudes towards the victim offender reconciliation programs. So in that aspect, it's growing not only from a public standpoint, but from the criminal justice system, it's growing even more. They like it. They like what it has to offer. Now, here's a situation that actually happened in real life, a real life victim offender reconciliation program. So, in Boulder, Colorado, there were two teens that stole power tools and equipment from a hardware store. After they were caught, arrested, taken to trial, the trial court gave them the option to have an open meeting with the offenders, the two teenagers, the parents of the two teenagers, and also the manager of the hardware store. They took that option. After they took that option, they agreed to repay what they stole. So, for the equipment, they had to pay a couple $100s. They also pledged that they would start seeing counselors for what was going on and why they did what they did. They also pledged that they're going to continue to go to school and they're going to make better grades in order to better themselves. So instead of taking a deal to go to jail, they decided to make right their wrongs with their victim and have a positive outcome without having to serve jail time. Looking at a specific program, now one of the ones that I found kind of interesting is in Polk County, Iowa. Now, Polk County's Victim Offender Reconciliation Program is based through their criminal justice system in that specific county. So it's not the whole state, it's just that county. But the mix is, even though it's ran through the criminal justice system, which is that local government, they have intermixed the restorative justice portion of their court system with community. So they've blended in the fact that, yes, it's ran through local government, but the only way that this is going to happen is if the community wants it to happen. So they've been able to instill that even though it's ran by the government, it's really the people who are the ones that are taking control and leading the charge. Now, going from that into the public interest, how does the public view victim offender reconciliation programs? Do they like it? Do they want more? Or would they prefer other means of punishment like incarceration? Now, when it comes to victim offender reconciliation programs, the general public finds it interesting. And interesting in the sense that it's not normal. Normally, if you commit a crime, you go on probation, you pay a fine, or you go to jail. And something interesting in the point that it's none of those things. They meet with victims. They get to talk to victims. The offender gets to speak to their victim. So they find it interesting. And alongside of being interesting, they find it very positive. They find it to be beneficial to both parties. Now, in talking about a specific state that ran a survey on their victim offender reconciliation programs. So a random sample in Minnesota was given out to, I think it was 250 people. 82% of those citizens thought that the victim offender reconciliation programs should be implemented more in the state. So 82% of the people that took this sample wanted more. They wanted to do more with this. Now, if you take those numbers and you give the same samples to every state that has a victim offender reconciliation program, there's a really, really good chance mathematically that a lot more states will want victim offender reconciliation programs as opposed to building more jails or having people being incarcerated. When it comes to the victims, a survey was done between 280 victims from 4 separate states. 91% of the victims felt that their offenders were voluntarily participating in it. They didn't feel like they had to. They weren't doing it just because it was going to lessen their time, but they wanted to do it. So 91% of those offenders, or 91% of the victims, felt that their offenders wanted to do it, and that's substantial, and that's a good sign. Now, on the other term, 70% of victims that did not get a chance to participate in victim offender reconciliation. This is outside of the 280 victims, but 70% of victims that did not get a chance to reconcile with their offender wish that they'd gotten the chance. They wish that the courts would have given them the chance to be able to meet with their offender. That is crazy to know that more and more victims want to be able to talk, want to be able to discuss what was going on with their offenders and what was going on with themselves. So that aspect of victim offender reconciliation is very, very positive and very uplifting for the criminal justice system. When I want to go into specific programs and evaluations of specific programs, something that hasn't been spoken of a lot is the juvenile correctional facilities and victim offender reconciliation programs. Although the Colorado case were 2 teenagers that were under the age of 18, there's a specific evaluation of an Ohio juvenile correctional facility. After evaluating their victim offender reconciliation program, it's seen as a more effective sentencing alternative than to incarceration or putting juveniles in like a detention facility. It was said that it gave the ability to the offenders to right their wrongs to the victims. It alleviated emotional burdens to victims, and out of this one program, it had an effective rating of 98.5%. So 98.5% of the people that were involved in this program enjoyed it, and they thought it was a positive outcome. Now, looking at the thoughts of victim offender reconciliation and what it does. So, in terms of restorative justice, victim offender reconciliation programs are a form of restorative justice. And restorative justice is relatively new, and it's not something that we know a lot about because it hasn't been practiced a whole lot. But this gives good insight to what restorative justice is and what restorative justice can do for the criminal justice system. Being able to rehabilitate offenders through mediation is important to both parties, not just the offender, but the victim as well. It helps everyone. It's not meant to help one person, but it's built to help everyone a part of it. And being able to apply more restorative ways to help not only the victim, but the offender as well can be a great tool in the correctional facility and the correctional system. So applying more tools that can rehabilitate offenders as well as victims after crimes helps everyone, not just one person. And with these things, it can be a great tool and a great asset. And looking at the future of victim offender reconciliation programs, so it's a continued growth for the nation. The amount of states, the amount of local governments, the amount of community-based agencies, they want more implementation of it. So the growth is great. The growth is a positive outlook on it. And with these programs, it further creates community ties to the correctional system. Just like in Polk County, it's ran by the government, but the community is the one that is really in control of it. It builds these ties between the average everyday citizen of a community and the people who enforce the laws. And this is a really good potential to become a more normal alternative sentencing than traditional incarceration. And along with that, it's able to decrease populations in prisons, which is a huge step forward for us. And with more funding to more qualified mediators and potentially bringing in psychiatric and psychological doctors, they can have more of an impact on offenders and victims, be able to help them even more than traditional counselors or community-based mediators. More funding could potentially mean more benefits and more positive outcomes. So with these ideas, the future of victim offender reconciliation can be something huge in the criminal justice world. And with that being said, hopefully we look more into restorative justice ideas, look more into victim offender reconciliation programs, and with that, we'll be able to better our knowledge, we'll be able to better our system in order to fix all the problems that are going on in the judicial system now, and the penal institutions, the jails, we'll be able to limit populations, we'll be able to fix a lot of things that are going on, and it's through programs like victim offender reconciliation that we learn a lot and we'll be able to do a lot more. So with all that being said, be on the lookout for victim offender reconciliation programs because they're growing and they're becoming a great tool for the American people, and not just the American people, but worldwide.